I'm JB. This is the Back It Up Binge podcast, and I'm joined by my co-host for this episode, JJ. JJ, welcome.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. Glad to have you on. We have a great guest today. He's a 9-year NFL veteran. He hit the century mark in games played at 100. Spent 6 seasons with your Giants, JJ.
I love it.
3 seasons with the Saints. Career, 234 receptions, 3,039 yards, and 16 TDs. But most importantly, he made his way to the NFL via the Garden State. Jersey strong, baby. I'm talking about number 85, wide receiver Don Herrmann. Don, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks very much. I'm glad to be on.
Appreciate you joining. First question out of the gate, Don. Who was your favorite team growing up, and who was your favorite athlete?
My favorite team, of course, was the Giants, being from New Jersey. And I thought my favorite player, I had two. One was Erich Barnes, who was a defensive back for the Giants, and the other was Del Schaffner, the receiver.
Okay.
I'm not sure if Erich is in a Hall of Fame or not. I think he's not, actually, because he played for 3 different teams, but he was a great cornerback for the Giants.
Okay. So let's start out with your career starting in college. You go to Waynesburg University, Division III, and you were a walk-on. Did you think that you had a legitimate shot at making the team? I mean, the challenge was there as a walk-on, and who helped you the most there in college?
As soon as I got there, I knew I could play there. I didn't have any questions about that. So I was pretty positive. They didn't cut anybody for once, you know. So,
oh, okay.
So you're automatically going to make the team. But the best part about it was I had a chance to develop there. And the head coach at that time, my first year, was Mo Scarry, who wound up coaching. He left after the first year to go to Washington Redskins with Otto Graham. And then from there, he went to Miami and was there about 18 years with Shula in Miami. Right. But he was very influential because, you know, he had an NFL career and was a very disciplined type coach. But the guy who helped me the most, I thought, was the next coach, Paul DePasqua, who wound up coaching at Pitt and I think in Steelers too. And one day, Carl sat down with me in the locker room, and I'm getting dressed, you know, and he's the head coach, and he comes in, he sits next to me, and he says, you know, you could be a lot better. You can really improve the game and take your game to the next level. And I thought, gee, the coach is sitting here next to me telling me this. And it really was an inspiration, I think, for me at that point.
That's great. During college, I read one of your games, you caught 7 touchdowns in a game. I mean, how does that happen? I mean, at like the 4th TD, are you guys like, all right, let's go for 5, 6, 7? I mean, how did that happen?
We threw a lot of passes.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. He said, we'll get you drafted. That was the 3rd coach that I had there. Gary was there for just the first year. Carl DePasqua was there for 2. And then the last year was Darrell Lewis. And we threw the ball a lot that year.
Okay.
And we'll get you drafted.
Nice. 7 TDs. That's fantastic. So then you finish up at Waynesburg. You get drafted in the 15th round, 1969 draft. You're part of a Giants draft class that includes Fred Dreyer, John Frenchy Fuqua. I'll ask you a question about him in a second. Again, challenge here. 15th rounder, challenge to make the team. What was your approach in training camp? And there, who was your biggest influence?
My approach was just to go out and work every day, you know. You have some apprehensions, you know, walking on, and you've seen the size of these guys compared to Division III, and looking how quick and how fast they are when you start to run patterns against them and everything. But my mindset was just work hard every day, try and improve, you know, a little bit, whatever it is. Listen to the coaches, do what they tell you to do, and just try and get better every day that you went out there. So I had a couple scrimmages, you know, and I made some catches in the scrimmages, and every week it just seemed to get better and better.
One of your teammates in that draft class was Frenchy Fuqua, and I wanted to just ask you a sidebar question here. He was part of one of the most famous plays in NFL history, the Immaculate Reception. Did you ever talk to him about that play?
I never saw John after he left New York.
Oh, okay.
You know, we were rookies together, and he was a good back, you know. I was kind of surprised that they let him go. when he was at Pittsburgh, he had these shoes that were high heels, and they were clear, and he had fish in the shoes. He was quite a character, you know what I mean? But yeah, he was a good back, and I was kind of sorry to see him go.
So, Don, I want to talk about one of my favorite Giant players. I'm a Giant fan. We had season tickets when I was growing up, and I used to love Fran Tarkenton, first real scrambling quarterback. When you came to the Giants, he was your QB, correct?
Correct.
Now, what was it like playing with him, being a mobile quarterback? What was that like for you?
Well, the best thing, everybody that talks about Stram being a scrambler, but, he was extremely smart. I mean, he knew what to call in situations. And then he helped you, like you knew he was going to move. So if you ran a pattern, you needed to, once the pattern was over, if it broke down, you couldn't stop. You had to get into a throwing lane in the direction that he was going. In other words, if I ran on the left side, which a lot of times I did, and he broke out of the pocket to the right, well, you got to turn right away and get going in that direction. And a lot of times you would lose a defensive back, But he would tell you stuff. He would tell you stuff, Fran, because he was smart. Just to give you one example, we run a pattern against Herb Adderley. It's just a square out, the 10-yard square out. And Adderley jumps in front of me, and the ball's high, and he has it in his hands over his head. But I was right behind him, and I was able to jump and take the ball out of his hands. I go back to the huddle, and Tarkenton says to me, run the same pattern. He's going to be 10 yards off of you. We run the same pattern. He's 10 yards off of me.
Wow.
That's the kind of guy Fran was. He just knew the situation. When Alex Webster became the head coach, Herrmann was our coach when I got there, and he got fired. And Alex took over. And Alex didn't have any experience as being a head coach. He really wasn't ready to be a head coach. So Fran really was the offensive guy. Bill Walton was there, but they used to get into some discussion sometimes because Fran knew what he wanted to do. And he just, he was just a real general on the field all the time.
Now, when you had your first NFL game, which I'm sure everybody remembers, you had 2 TD passes you caught.
Right.
As a 15th round draft pick, to catch 2 TD passes in your first game, what was that like? I mean, what was running through your mind? I'm sure you remember vividly. I mean, who catches 2 TD passes in their first game?
Yeah, I didn't think about that, but I thought about the fact that I caught 2 and that we won. We beat the Vikings, who went to the Super Bowl that year. That was our opening game. We got into a situation where we were behind by 2 scores. I think we won 24-23. I think, and Tarkenton just brought us back. So it was all really on him. Which Will made a great catch on a tip ball, which kept us in the game. It's just part of the game. You don't think about it in that way. You just think, what do I have to do? What do I have to do to get open? And try to make the play. And that's it.
JJ mentioned the mobility of Tarkenton.
Yeah.
You lined up with Homer Jones on the opposite side of you, who was just a trailblazer. The guy had all the speed in the world, all-time leader in yards per catch at 22. I think at least almost 2 yards per catch ahead of the second place person. What was it like lining up on the other side of him? And did he present opportunities for you because people were focusing on him?
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. He was really a phenomena. If you looked at Homer, he wasn't 190 pounds. This guy's 220, and he's running the 9.300.
Wow.
You're talking about a guy that he was very, very powerful, and he had great speed. We're trying to get him into the Hall of Fame right now. He and Jack Kemp, a friend of mine, is trying to get him into the Hall of Fame. But Homer, he was a powerful type guy. And it was hard for defensive backs to try and tackle him because he had size, But just to tell you one interesting story, we go to Dallas my rookie year, and they got Cornell Green, who's an all-pro safety. Fran throws me a ball, and it's low. and I go down to get the ball, and Cornell comes up and he kicks me in the back on purpose. And the referee is standing right there and doesn't do anything. Homer walks over, puts his finger in Cornell's face and says, "If you do that again," he said, "I'll break your neck."
Wow.
So he always had your back, and those guys and Cornell got the message, you know. He's a powerful guy, and he could run. You know, if you watch Homer, he's got 22 yards to catch, but he's catching 5-yard outs and breaking tackles.
Yeah.
You know, that's what he did. They had trouble tackling them.
Don, in the history of the New York Giants, obviously, Homer was probably in your era the best at the position. Who would you say in football at the time was the best?
Are you asking me about that era or all time on it?
Both.
Because the guy that's on Cincinnati right now is phenomenal.
You talk about Chase?
Yeah, what a year he just had, right?
Yeah, he's tremendous.
Homer's obviously one of them, you know, just because he has more long touchdowns, I think, than anybody's ever had in the league, you know.
Everyone tried to imitate him, you know, with the just sprint and have the bomb, you know, run under the ball.
Yeah, but he did it, you know, he could do that, but he could also, like I said, get that 5-yard one and break it, go for a touchdown. You know, they wanted to run a race between him and Bob Hayes at the Pro Bowl.
Did they really?
Yeah, and Wellington Mara mixed it.
In that era, right, you have Homer Jones as number 1 all time, but he's, like you mentioned, Don, he's not in the Hall of Fame. I forget who number 2 is. I think 5 is Bob Hayes. Number 4 is Paul Warfield, and he's in the Hall, and he has the most yards per catch of everybody in the Hall. You played Miami a couple of times. Do you remember watching him as you played on the sidelines, and what was he like to go up against?
Warfield was a tremendous receiver. My brother-in-law, who played for Cleveland as a defensive tackle, told me, he said, if you watched him in workouts, he worked extremely hard. He said he really worked hard all the time, and he was such a smooth receiver, you know. He was really one of the all-time greats.
Right.
During your 9-year career, you had 2 seasons where you had over 500 yards receiving, which is really good in an era where they were running. What were your most memorable, when you look back on it, what was most memorable to you?
I think, I think the one year I was the number 7 receiver in the league, wide receiver. And that was at a time when a lot of the tight ends were leading the league in catches. I think Bob Tucker led the league. So that was an outstanding year for me. But the Giants were in a situation at that time where we didn't have a home field. We were playing up at the Yale Bowl. And we were practicing at Roosevelt Stadium, and we didn't some of the time. So we didn't even have a home. So to keep that focus on during that era when we were playing up there, I thought that was the best year I had.
So now I got a difficult question for you. In today's game, obviously quarterbacks are protected, and rightfully so. When you played defensive backs, there was an anything goes, Wild West type of mentality. Did you remember any specific hits or any defensive backs or defenses that you faced where you remember where, you know, because defensive backs in those days really wanted to ring the wide receiver's bell if they could?
Well, I don't remember it because I didn't wake up. We're playing in New Orleans, and I run a slant. The guy puts the helmet right on my chin.
Wow.
And I woke up. Of course, he went right back in the game once they put the smelling salt underneath it. You know, actually, I made the catch. I don't know how, but I did. I reached up. He put the helmet right on the chin.
Wow. Was there a particular player that stood out, a defensive back?
Well, I think there were a couple. One was Barney. Yeah, he was a terrific corner, extremely quick. Not big, but extremely quick, you know. And he just had a sense over there on the defensive side of the field where that ball was going somehow. He really did. Another guy who was totally different was Mel Blount for the Steelers. Now, Mel, you know, most corners are pretty small, even today. Mel Blount was 6'4", 220. and he's running a 4.4, 4.5, 40. So you play against a guy like that, you can't muscle him, and he's got great speed. And that's why Pittsburgh had, they had those great defenses, but he was certainly one of the best there.
Great.
There you go. So you mentioned Alex Webster. You also played for Bill Arnsparger and you played for Hank Stram. What were they like as coaches, and who do you think fit your style of play the best, their system to your style? Alex wasn't really ready to be a head coach. And so he dictated a lot of the stuff to Joe Walton, who was the offensive coordinator. And Alex was more or less was just a figurehead at that time. They had fired Allie Herrmann because everybody was singing Goodbye Allie. Actually, we played a game in Montreal and they sang Au revoir Allie up there. But they fire him at the end of the preseason. Alex takes the job, and for the next 5 years he's the head coach. But he's really not involved in the offensive end of it or the defensive end of it. He's just really a figurehead. And Tarkenton and Joe was the offensive, guy, and Joe Walton was the offensive coordinator. And I think Jimmy Garrett, was running the defense at that time. And so then Arnsparger comes in, and Bill is really a defensive coach. He doesn't spend much time on the offense at all. So, and then I was there, and I got hurt. I got hurt his first year and missed the last half of the season. And I go back to camp the next year, and I get hurt again in the preseason, and then they released me. So I only had part of the year with Arnsparger, And then from there, I got picked up by the Saints, and Hank was a wonderful coach. He was a player's coach all the way. He would do anything he could to make it better for you so that you'd play better, He was just that kind of guy. And he had Sam Latigliano was my receiver coach there, who went on to be the head coach of Cleveland. Right.
They were similar. They really were. It wasn't, today with all the slots and everything, the motions and everything, but it's a lot harder on the defense, I think, to be able to line up. There, you pretty much had plays. You just did what the offense called for on it. I think it wasn't real sophisticated. Going from one team to another, it was pretty much the same thing. So there wasn't a whole lot of difference.
Okay. You mentioned a name. Obviously, we talked about Hank Stram, but you also mentioned Sam Rutigliano, and NFL Films made these two guys really popular, right? Rutigliano was the guy who's hunched over as the head coach. The Browns saying one time. And then you have Hank Stram in the Super Bowl matriculating it down the field. That's the way to go, boys. Was Hank Stram the same guy you saw on the films? And do you have any good stories about him you could share?
Not a lot of stories about Hank, but we went to camp in New Orleans, and John Meekum was the owner, and he said, I gave Hank an open checkbook, unlimited to do what he wanted. And he spent that before we got out of training camp. So, and Hank would stay in the finest, the nice hotels, and he would wear one suit to the game, change, wear a suit on the sideline, and then change again on. I think his father had been a tailor or something. But he was just a guy who was there for the players. I wanted to get a car. In New York, one of the dealers always gave me a car. New Orleans wasn't like New York, It wasn't, I guess it's Apple, and I don't know. And I went in there one day and I said, Coach, I need a car. I always had one in New York. He says, all right, Nani, come back tomorrow. I go back tomorrow. He says, go see this guy. Right away, he had a car for me. So he would just do anything for you.
Don, I just wanted to go back to one great thing that you said before. You were talking about, coming back from injury, and then when players of that era got injured, was that on your mind coming back that they could drop you, and how much did that influence how much pain you played with? It must have been very hard to know that you're injured, but they could drop you. What runs through your mind in those instances?
Well, if you've got a family, you really think about what am I going to do, for work. I had got, I understood why they released me. I mean, I had missed 7 games and then got hurt again, and they're not going to stay with somebody who's injured, consistently. So you just, I was hoping somebody would pick me up. That's all I could say. So, and actually, as it turned out, Tom Blanchard, who had been the punter for the Giants, was in New Orleans. And they needed a receiver the last 3 games of the year, and I got picked up by them. And as it turned out, we must have had about 6 or 7 Giants go down to New Orleans after that. I was just blessed by God to do that. I really was.
Your time in football, college, the NFL, how do you look upon that, when you're looking back at your career?
Going to a small school, I tried to transfer. I wanted to get out and go to Purdue. I thought I could play there. I had a friend from high school who was playing there, and he said, yeah, you can play there. But if I had gone there, it would have been the biggest mistake of my life because I needed the time to develop at a small school. I was, as a player coming out of high school, I grew, and I had to learn to be a receiver. And so that was the best thing for me, was to be there. Not only that, but I wound up marrying my wife from there. So that was a big plus,
So, Don, after the 77 season, you retire. Can you talk a little bit about what you got involved with after your NFL career?
Yeah. When I grew up, my father had been in the building business, and he was kind of done with it at that point. But my brother and another fella wanted to go in and buy some properties and get started. So building was just a natural thing for us, and so we partnered up, and the 3 of us went in and we went into the house building business, and did that for the next 30 years. Between houses, additions, and even laboratories, I did all kinds of stuff, which gave me a lot of freedom to be able to do what I wanted. I wasn't working for a corporation where I had to do this all the time. I was able to buy a shore house, and take the kids down there for the summer. And
right.
It was a good business. It's a business where it goes up and down depending on the times. When mortgages, we had one job back in the late or the early 80s, I think it was, and we were paying 22% on a construction loan on the house.
Wow.
22%. And then this guy from Dartmouth, who was real smart, said, you'll never see single-digit mortgages again. Of course, the last mortgage I had was 2.75. That shows how smart they are. But, that's what it was in the building business, and I was like both. I was hands-on in that I did some of the stuff I learned to do, roofing, sheetrocking, and everything else, but I was also a contractor who, I hired the electricians, I hired the masons, I hired the plumbers and all of that, So you learn to run the business and you do less and less, but getting your hands on help you to learn doing it, And it was, yep. I enjoyed that. I enjoyed doing that.
So you come from the era where people worked a second job in the off season, right? Is that what you did in the off season?
Well, I wasn't making $2 million a year. Yeah.
People forget that, right?
When I got $14,000, I was really happy.
That's too funny. So, Don, this has been great. Enjoyed discussing your career with you, post-career as well. Great story there. I'm going to close it out with what I like to call the binge burner, put you on the hot seat, give you a few names of teammates and your initial thoughts about them. First off, Norm Snead.
Norm, I had my best year with Norm. He could throw that deep ball, Norm. He could throw the deep ball, and he was a smart quarterback, too. I enjoyed playing a lot with Norm. He was a smart guy. He was a big guy, and he was very calm in the huddle. He wasn't a scrambler like Fran or anything, but he had a lot of ability. Norm, yeah, he was a good quarterback.
How about one of my favorites, Ron Johnson?
Should be in the Hall of Fame. Ron was one of the best all-around backs that I played with. We would run, he was a great runner, but he was also a great pass catcher, and we would run options for Ron coming out of the backfield. And one other thing that Ron could do that a lot of guys can't is he was great at blitz pickup. A lot of backs don't like to do that. And that's what made him great back, is that he could do all 3 of those things, Now,
how about television actor who was able to pivot very, very well from football, Fred Dreyer?
What do you want to know about Fred? He's a nut.
How about Chuck Muncie?
Chuck was just, I never saw anybody could run a sideline the way Chuck did. If he had a guy on the sideline, trying to make a tackle on him, boy, he was going to punish that guy. I mean, he really laid a shoulder into people on that sideline, and he would get extra yardage, but he was one tough. He came right from Uniontown, which was right near Waynesburg.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was right from Western PA there and died pretty young. But, yeah, that was one powerful sideline runner.
You had an interesting 1-2 combo there because you had Muncie and you had Tony Galbraith, right?
Yeah, lightning and thunder.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Nice.
Tony wound up playing for the Giants.
That's right. All right, Don, last one here. Archie Manning.
Archie missed a lot of the time that I was there. I got there the last 3 games of the year, and he played nose. Actually, threw me a touchdown in one of them against the Giants. I came back against the Giants, and in the off season, they tied the tendon in his shoulder too tight, so he missed. And the doctor said, "You just have to keep stretching it, keep stretching." Well, it didn't stretch, and he missed the whole next year. They had to reoperate on the shoulder. So he comes back the next year, and I don't think that he was ready totally the next year, and that was my last year with him. He played the whole year, but, he had sat out a year, and I don't know if he was, 100% when he got there that last year. So it was hard, but he could run.
So what's interesting, Don, is I've interviewed a few players from different teams, and everyone that we go through on this binge burn around, you said Ron Johnson. I had another guy, Stu Voigt, say Chuck Foreman. I had William Andrews say a couple of his offensive linemen. And I've heard other podcasts where players say this player should be in the Hall of Fame. Why is there such a disconnect? Is it, in your opinion, do you think it's mostly based on stats? Because when I look at Ron Johnson's stats, I mean, it was only 81 games. We had 4,300 yards. He had 40 TDs rushing. To your point, 213 receptions and 15 TDs. This guy scored 55 TDs in 81 games.
Yeah. But like I said, the thing about Ron, though, even more than the statistics, was he was such a great all-around back.
Right.
The other guys, I played with Muncie, who was a real good runner, like I said, on the sideline, but he wasn't the pass catcher that Ron was, He was pretty good on blitz pickup, but these guys had different abilities, but Ron had all 3. He really did. Homer, was another one. Homer had all that, Homer had that power and speed and everything, so I don't know. Statistics play the biggest part of it, probably. That's what people look at.
I agree.
And then you have to be on a team where you've got a good quarterback, you've got a good offensive line, you got a good. If you're on defense, you got a good defensive people around you, and that's going to make you better. When you're on offense and you go in the meeting and they tell you hurry up and get out of the pattern, you got a pretty good idea of what kind of offensive line you got,
Do you stay active with the Giants?
I'll go to alumni games, and then I'll play in some golf outings, and that's about it,
Gotcha.
Yeah, other than that, I don't do anything, yeah. And now at this point, I don't know many people.
Don, this has been fantastic. Appreciate you coming on. It was great hearing your story. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's nice that people remember stuff, and I'm always thankful that the Lord gave me that opportunity to play,